Jewel. Thank you all so much for being here, everyone from Alston and Bird, and we have folks from Georgia Justice Project and Georgia Pacific, and I know we have guests from Equal Justice Works in DC, so thank you to everyone here and all of our guests, and we are thrilled to present this program to y'all as part of our Pro Bono Week. Criminal justice reform continues to be at the forefront of policy discussions at both the state and federal levels. And so we are excited that we have assembled this great group of experts on this issue to lead a panel discussion for us to talk about the issues and the current landscape and trending topics. So our moderator for today is Jenny Kim, who's to my right. She is the Deputy General Counsel and Political Law and Vice President Public Policy for our client, Koch Companies Public Sector, LLC. She also serves on the board of the Coalition for Public Safety and U.S. Justice Action Network, which advocate for criminal justice reform. And so I would like to thank you for being here today, and we'll turn it over to you to introduce all of our other panelists and get us started.
All right,
thank
great.
you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Again, my name is Jenny Kim, and really all those fancy titles, all it means is that I am an office janitor, a psychiatrist, and sometimes henchman. But anyway, be that as may, good morning, good afternoon, wherever time zone that you're in. Thank you very much for attending this, whether virtually or in person. I want to set this up on criminal justice reform. It is the issue du jour. It is also, I think, a surrogate for a lot of other issues we probably need to discuss because I'm heartened to hear that Mary calls us experts, but the reality is every day that you deal with this system and understand more about how it works, you realize how many other areas it intersects with, like education and healthcare and the budget, and that's kind of the surrogate that everyone's kind of fighting over. Everyone's heard a lot about the bipartisanship, the transpartisanship, the nonpartisanship over criminal justice reform, but contrary to news articles, blogosphere, and everything else, the reality of making system reforms is much harder than it may appear, because just as everything is interconnected, there are many, many people involved in reforming the system as well. And so with that, Koch Industries is involved in reforming the criminal justice system for over a decade, probably closer to 15 to 20 years. And why the business case for criminal justice reform? Because at the end of the day, we are about opportunity and removing barriers to opportunity for everyone. And the criminal justice system is a big failed government program, as my boss, Mark Holden, calls it often. And we are a global company, and like many companies, we are competing for the best talent, not just the best talent without a criminal record. Just to keep some things in mind, we are an interesting country. We're 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the imprisoned population. Basically, also 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. That means about 70 million. At the same time, there's about 6 in 10 people in jails have never been convicted of anything. And they probably have jobs. They're probably taxpayers. So when you hear politicians always talk about increasing the taxpayer base, et cetera, it probably would be good to reform the system so that they can be part of society and be reintegrated. Those in prison, 2.3 million in America, 95% of them return home. And 75% of those who return home within a year cannot find employment. And while finding a job is not the end-all and be-all, many reentry experts will tell you that you need cognitive, emotional, behavioral, family and friend support, etc. Finding a job is part of the equation, including housing and the like. And when 75% can't find it, then that explains a lot for the probably 60% recidivism rate we have in this country overall. So with that, all that exciting stuff and depressing stuff, we have our panelists here to sort of address why criminal justice reform now, what all you all can do if you are interested in getting involved, and also to talk about the technological aspects of criminal justice reform. Because after all, we are America. We take pills to take away our pain. We think there's a cure-all for everything. We oversize everything. So we think technology is going to be a panacea for all our criminal justice problems. And you will hear, I think, all our panelists describe why it's probably not the panacea that a lot of people are saying that it will be. So you can all read their official bios, and that's very not interesting. So to start off, Jason Tashea is from Alaska. He's with Justice Codes. Follow him at Justice Codes and at Jason J. Tashea on Twitter. There's a lot of interesting stuff on that Twitter feed. He has from a state that has led on the CJR front. And fun fact, Steven Seagal stayed at his family when they were filming a movie. It's called On Deadly Ground. I don't know. And ate dinner. Was not a very good guest. I understand, Jason, right?
No, my mother was unimpressed.
Okay. On a similar vein, Erin is originally from Wyoming. She is a senior project manager at U.S. Justice Action Network. She is a daredevil. She's gone skydiving several times in Slovenia and New Zealand. Good for her. And last but not least, she attended the Family Against Mandatory Minimums event and was privileged to take a photo with Busta Rhymes, right? And let's talk about technology, right? Most of us hate to shop, so she was appropriately attired in a Gucci-esque outfit from Stitch Fix. All right. And last but not least, Jon Rapping. Everyone knows Gideon's promise. He is always on message about the importance of public defense and also the fact that criminal defense lawyers are in the Constitution, kind of like the military, the Army, and the Navy. And his interesting fact is that he went to a courtroom hearing when he was 6 years old. His mom took him there to support friends who were there because they had been arrested for in the Vietnam War protests. And to protect himself and his family and from the authorities, he put a water gun in his pants.
Fortunately, didn't have to use it.
Oh, unfortunately, not to use it. So, and with that, John, why don't you get us started? Like, how would that water gun be treated nowadays if you took it in? Would you even been able to take it into the courts nowadays? So why criminal justice reform now, and why you?
You know, that's actually a valid question because we all know that 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed for playing with a gun that was legally purchased. John Crawford was shot in Walmart carrying a gun that he took off a shelf there in Walmart. You know, why now? I think when you look at what those two have in common and what unfortunately a disproportionate number of people who not only are shot and killed in police encounters, but more likely arrested, thrown into a criminal justice system and processed into a prison cell, what they tend to have in common is they are almost exclusively poor, disproportionately of color. So why now? I think that there really is no greater civil rights issue facing the country today than criminal justice reform. Criminal justice tends to be the, I don't want to say the one place left maybe untouched by the civil rights movement. I would argue we are worse off than we were 50 years ago. It's not the one place, but I think it probably it is most significantly either unaffected or worse off. And so I'll wait for another question when my turn comes around again, but the short answer is I think it's a civil rights imperative.
Okay. Jason?
Why criminal justice reform? It's because it's needed. Before moving to Baltimore, where I'm currently based, I did international rule of law development work focused on criminal justice reform. So in Armenia, in Kosovo, in other countries in the developing or post-conflict world, I was working on these issues. And I had to just reflect one day in Kosovo, where I was before coming to Baltimore, where the incarcerated juvenile population in this country of 1.7 million was 48 kids. And I was like, well, I'm not really sure that my efforts are going towards the most impactful problem. I think what's important to remember is that America has the criminal justice system it has because we're a rich country. Like, poor countries can't afford to incarcerate at the rate that we incarcerate. And so because of the amount of people that Jenny pointed out have records. So 70 million people have records. And that doesn't mean 70 million people in this country have been convicted of a crime. It means 70 million people have been arrested and processed to some degree. That's insane. And then this becomes the scarlet letter that holds them back from finding work, finding government benefits, finding housing, and moving their lives forward, as Jenny already made the case for. That's why now, and that's why here in the United States.
Erin?
I should also probably start by saying I should be careful what I tell Jenny, because it'll be used in me in an opening introduction again in the future. Why justice reform now? Well, I should also let you all know that I'm probably the one non-lawyer in the room. If there are anyone else out there, I would like your company, and along with the panel. But, there's my crowd back there. I didn't come to this issue naturally. Criminal justice issues, I worked on other issues being from Wyoming and cared about other issues that you'd think of someone in a rural community talked about. But then as soon as, you start learning how our system functions. You see people you encounter interact with the system. You look at it from a fiscal conservative perspective and how much states are spending on incarceration compared to things like education, transportation. You have to ask yourself, why am I not involved? Why aren't we working on these issues? And then as a person working at a bipartisan organization that partners with organizations that really do span the political spectrum, whether it's Freedom Works or Americans for Tax Reform or the Center for American Progress and the ACLU, why justice reform now? Well, you have fiscal conservatives taking a hard look at their state budgets when they're all experiencing crazy deficits and understanding corrections and policing and other factors in our justice system. They're in top 3, top 5 budget line items for most states. When you start talking to people who got involved in the issue because of faith reasons, ideologies based on redemption, second chances, working with incarcerated populations, it started to bubble up from there. And then you have the civil rights concerns, and a history of locking up people that we're mad at or punishing people that, are pretty much in incarceration because of poverty and other things that, are dirty words we don't want to talk about. It brought everyone together, and that's where U.S. Justice Action Network and Coalition for Public Safety came from, because you had fiscal conservatives concerned about justice reform because of what it's costing states. You have civil rights concerns. You have faith concerns. Faith and Freedom Coalition is part of our organization. So that's why now, we don't have the time to not talk about it.
So, Erin, U.S. Justice Action Network has experienced quite a number of successes, at least in 13 states, as far as I can count. And why the states have been successful on this? You talk a little bit about the fiscal, but it's not just the fiscal, I think, overall, because we overall in this nation spend $250 billion on the criminal justice system, and $80 billion of that goes to just incarcerating people, and most people do not come out of the system better than they went in.
Why the states? Being from D.C., I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but what can we actually get done in Congress? Last Congress, this Congress, things are slow to move, and there are some political fights that are going to drown out some of these other issues. But the states, they have budgets that they need to balance. They have huge workforces that are not contributing to their state economy because they're locked up for extreme amounts of time, or we place these collateral consequences on individuals, or we prevent them from contributing to the state economy because they can't get a job, they can't get an occupational license because they have a criminal background. Not even just a conviction, sometimes just an arrest record prevents interaction in the system. So state legislators, they're close to their people. They interact with their constituents. They have a direct contact with not only people coming in and out of the system, but their constituents who are talking about my family member, my cousin, the person down the street experienced this, and I don't understand why they're being locked up for a significant amount of time for what we would define as nonviolent crimes. So I think states are closer to the issue and have budget concerns, and it's driving movement. They're also, as some people say, the laboratories of democracy. So they're more willing to take chances and kind of step out there on issues that they're not comfortable on. So they're the first to kind of lead the way in combating that tough on crime stigma. JRI, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, has passed moved in about, 30 states?
Yeah, 35, yeah.
35 states now? That's unbelievable.
Why has transpartisanship worked in the states?
It could be because you can't ignore your neighbor. You're closer to the people you work with in state legislatures. People in Congress, they can isolate themselves to their state, not get to know their colleagues as well. But in the state legislators, these are your neighbors, the people in the county over that you have to work with. And like I said, it really is a bipartisan issue. Whether you come at it from a fiscal perspective or a civil justice, a civil rights issue, a faith issue, you're able to work with these people. You deal with them every day.
All right. So given transpartisanship, I think there's agreement, Jon, that public defense is very important. And
agreement on this stage?
Yeah, agreement on the stage. I think agreement, there are institutions on the right, like Cato, and I think the Soros-funded institutions believe public defense is important, even though they've moved on to other priorities, unfortunately. But can you explain to a little bit, so Erin and Jason mentioned all the collateral consequences that people deal with. How are public defenders part of the solution, aside from having job security built within the Constitution?
So I really think that largely the driver behind our current state of criminal justice is that we have embraced a narrative. I actually see Brian Stevenson's book as a recommended reading at the end of the handout everyone has, right? And Brian talks about this narrative of justice. And we've embraced this narrative that sees certain communities as others. It really sees certain communities as less worthy of protection, as more dangerous. There is a lot of social science now around the issue of implicit racial bias that lets us know that that a different kind of racism is helping to fuel our current state of criminal justice. It's no longer as much about the explicit racism. It's well-intentioned people who truly believe they're engaging in justice, but who have come to subconsciously embrace this connection between race and criminality. And I think as long as we are otherizing other communities, it becomes much easier to turn a blind eye to what is happening. And so why are public defenders important? I think the main reason, oftentimes people answer that question by talking about the Constitution. And I think that's certainly true. Quite frankly, my guess is there's a room full of, not everyone's a lawyer, but a lot of lawyers in this room. If I asked you what's the first thing you'd do if you got in legal trouble, my guess is most of you would say call a lawyer. We recognize a lawyer is critical to helping us out of that precise problem at that precise moment. And that's one reason why public defenders are really important. But I think even bigger than that is collectively public defenders speak for 80% of the people in the criminal justice system. 80% of the people in the criminal justice system are too poor to afford lawyers. What we do at Gideon's Promise is we are building a movement of public defenders to understand their job as more broad than just representing one person at a time, one case at a time, but to collectively infuse the system with a voice that has been silenced, that has been ignored, that has to be heard and respected before we get the will to start treating people the way we would treat our own loved ones.
How much success have you experienced in trying to get that message and infuse it more and more? Because I think those who know Gideon's Promise believe in its mission, like we do on the stage, right? But how do you spread that message more and sort of make it kind of part of the dialogue?
So I think we've been successful in this sense. This is not a short-term fix, but there are people doing really good work trying to get communities to have access to the criminal justice system. We work with a lot of public defender offices that really, through their partnership with Gideon's Promise, have re-envisioned what their role is in their community. So we have offices that have always cared about trying to give individuals really good representation. But now you'll see our offices building partnerships with churches, building partnerships with community groups, starting to think about how they can work with community groups to help tell the stories of people in the criminal justice system. If I could deviate for a quick second, some of you, I understand, heard my wife speak earlier this year. She came to Alston Bird. My wife and I co-founded Gideon's Promise. She's not a lawyer. She was a school teacher, trained as an educator, and she tells a story about how when she was 5 years old, her father was arrested for crimes he had committed years earlier. By the time he was arrested, he had gotten married. He had 3 kids. Her baby brother was on the way. Her father had bought a fish market. He was a small business owner, converted to Islam. But he was arrested for crimes years earlier, given a public defender that never told his story. He was sent to prison. She grew up with her father in prison. She watched most men in her family go to prison. She brought her baby brother to school with her at Cornell, hoping she could save him. He ended up in prison with no male role models. And what she says is, as devastating as it was to watch my father in prison, as devastating as it was to watch men I loved locked up, what was even more devastating was as a child realizing my life has no value. My community has no value. And that message was sent to her most directly by the public defenders that represented the men she loved, because they didn't think to tell the story. They saw lawyering as a narrow technical skill. She became a school teacher because she thought, I want nothing to do with the criminal justice system. And she went through Teach for America and started teaching in Washington, D.C. She tells a story about a young man she represented, 6 years old, first grade. His nickname to everyone, including people in his community, was Little Lorton. Lorton is the prison outside of D.C. She realized that as a school teacher, every kid she was working with were coming from communities crippled by the criminal justice system. And that, as you said, these are all interconnected, Jenny, that teachers couldn't succeed if we didn't reform criminal justice. They couldn't overcome the trauma and damage these communities were inflicting on the children she represented, or that she taught. So she became a criminal justice reformer because she understood that we've got to give communities voice. And I think our public defenders are starting to get that, to partner with communities, to see their role differently and to see it more broadly.
All right, Jason, so John's kind of presented a reimagining of justice, which is the Connecticut governor is having a conference in Hartford right now. I just came from that yesterday. So technology, and we've discussed this before, which is the only useful AV article I've ever read. But anyway, technology is supposed to be the panacea. Body cameras are supposed to fix all the policing issues. Data is supposed to help us figure out whose records need to get expunged just like that. But and soon we will all be replaced in this room by AI. But how is technology the solution, but how is it also not the solution? And what do we have to think about when we integrate technology into the criminal justice system?
Since this room is primarily lawyers, you understand fairly well that our legal system is not meant for radical change. It's not meant for disruption in the Silicon Valley sense. And yet the people that have the capacity and ability to build these tools come from that world. So they want to disrupt criminal justice. Even though they've never stepped foot in a courthouse, they themselves have never gone through a litigation, either on the criminal or the civil side. And so they come, I think, from the right place, usually, sparked by seeing something like The 13th or reading the new Jim Crow, a kind of a popular and very accessible way to get introduced to these issues. And then they're like, oh, well, if we just come to this issue and do the right thing, then we will get the solution that we want. And time again, these projects are foiled by that. And I think what's interesting with technology, that's a shift in the reform space from traditional either lobby efforts or from legal efforts, is that these are groups that understand scalability and look to replicate and cross-apply solutions in jurisdictions. And that's, if any of you do cross-jurisdiction work, that's not the case, right? Every state has a different expungement statute, if a state has an expungement statute at all. So a group in Chicago might build a tool that looks very promising on that front, but the folks in Mississippi have a completely different set of rules, standards, and procedures that they need to work around. So you can't just scale it like you can a ride-hailing service or a food delivery app. And so these are the constant challenges that these people are coming up against, but there's a lot of new money in Silicon Valley that are becoming interested in these issues, and even more so since last year's election. It seems that Silicon Valley has gotten a little bit more political, a little bit more radical in regards to opposing the current administration in D.C. And so now there's even more attention, but not necessarily more background knowledge or information for them to go ahead and do the right thing. What's even more weird in the research that I've done is that sometimes you just see tools that are racist by their core definition. There's been apps like Sketch Factor or A Good Part of Town, which definitionally tell you how to avoid bad areas of the town, which usually means minority and poor communities, regardless of any other factor. Those projects have failed. But there are tools like Nextdoor, which doesn't have a racist core. For those that don't know, Nextdoor is a micro social media platform where you, on the neighborhood level, can interact with your neighbors through a Facebook-like interface. Nextdoor is a criminal justice and safety portal where people can post concerns they have about safety or things they see in their community that others in their neighborhood should be aware of. And they've come up against, as Jon was talking about, implicit bias is well known in our day-to-day sphere, and it just found a new outlet online through platforms like Nextdoor. So while not being inherently negative towards a particular class or a group of people, Nextdoor has found itself in this problem of bias in criminal justice as well. And they've begun to do things. Initially, they said it's not a problem. And then they started posting a bunch of blog posts about how they're fixing this not problem that they have. So you can take that with a grain of salt. But I think there's this belief that tech is for good, that these folks are coming from an altruistic place, and therefore we should take their solutions seriously. But oftentimes, the traditional problems that we see in justice and human interaction are going to crop up there anyway. And secondly, oftentimes it's solutions in search of a problem where they don't understand the system well enough to actually go ahead and take the technology that they do have, which is desperately needed in the criminal justice space, but actually apply it in an impactful way that actually helps people move their lives forward.
So a lot of governments are seeing technology as a way, if they have the means, to just kind of purchase everything. What are things that governments should look for before they just randomly start purchasing things and announce at a press conference, this will solve all our problems?
Yeah, I think by and large, what I've seen in regards to public-facing apps, whether they be expungement or paths towards governor pardons or something like that, is that these tools by and large haven't worked very well because just because you put the thing online doesn't mean people are going to find it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in regards to search engine optimization to make something relevant to when you use Google. I mean, Google's normative, right? How many people here go to page 3 of a Google result in their day-to-day lives, right? So, okay, so we have one person, two people. Statistically, about 5% of people leave the first page of Google results. So if you're not getting on that top page and really within the top 3, then you're functionally irrelevant, even though you put all this effort in to do this work. I think where the big effort needs to be for state-level criminal justice reform, government, and technology is on data collection. They're terrible. Right? It's awful. One, there's no standardization across jurisdictions in regards to what certain things mean or what should be collected. But I've worked in states where it's literally a different system county to county. Unified court system states are a different story. But even in those states, their data collection can be pretty sparse. I mean, that's not a sexy issue. It's not the thing people in Silicon Valley or foundations want to necessarily throw energy and funds after. But without that information, Erin and Jon can't do their work in the same impactful way that they would otherwise be able to. So it's like really a crux.
I'm going to ask you about a specific project that's out there that just has been announced, Measures for Justice.
Mm-hmm.
What's good about them? What could be? And now they just, I think, mapped out only about 6 states thus far. But what's great about them, and what do you think can be improved with that particular tool?
For those that don't know, Measures for Justice is a nonprofit in upstate New York. It's run by a woman named Amy Bach, and they're legit in the most basic way in regards to the criminal justice reform movement. They're not people that have just arrived to the scene. They've been doing this for quite some time. And a couple weeks ago, they released their data portal where they're collecting county-level data across the country so that they're in one place, in one catalog. You can start looking county to county within a state, across state lines, to compare different outcomes within different aspects of the criminal justice system. This is something that's desperately needed. Why the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the DOJ isn't already doing this work dumbfounds me, but Measures for Justice has stepped in anyhow. The first states that they've released, if you look at them, they started with states with the most permissive public records laws. It's because it was the easiest way for them to get this particular information. I think it will be an uphill climb as they expand into other states that aren't as permissive with those rules. I think the challenges that they're going to have are sustainability. Currently, they have a lot of attention and a lot of Silicon Valley money, actually. Mark Zuckerberg's wife.
And hedge fund money, too.
Yes.
Hedge fund money.
The Zuckerbergs have put money into it, and private interest has put money in as well. And that's because it's the big thing now. The interesting thing with nonprofit funding, I think, which is a challenge in the software world, is that attention's wane. No one wants to go fund version 4 security patch updates. And that's what's required if you want to keep a software project alive. And so it'll be interesting to see what the longevity of this project is, and also how they're going to go ahead and update this information going forward. They want to expand to 20 states in the next 3 years, but in that time, the data they collected that first 6 states is being left to atrophy unless they have a plan and a solution to be able to shore that up. So while there's a lot of promise for the work that they're doing, I think there's some unanswered questions in regards to how do you make that project both live on as well as make it impactful.
Okay. Jenny, I don't know if you know this, but we actually partnered with Measures for Justice through a grant through DOJ, and they did some findings. They did some work in Tennessee that suggest the initial findings suggest that the lawyers trained by Gideon's Promise actually receive better outcomes, shorter prison terms, less likely to plead guilty, cases resolved more quickly. So I echo fandom of Amy Bach and Measures for Justice.
Well, no, actually, anecdotally speaking, we spoke with a couple legislators for one of the 6 states. I'm not going to identify the state, but oftentimes legislators are in denial about their state's problems. And when they saw the public defense statistics, and it was not a complete 100% data set, they were horrified because these are libertarian, classical liberal leaning constitutional folks, and they didn't realize it was that bad. So, Jon, on that, what data sets need to be collected to help us kind of better define the storytelling of public defense and also to make public defense better?
So, interestingly, we're working currently with an organization called Get the Data to help us do some metrics to determine the success of our work. And what sort of drove us to get the data is I was doing some research in the medical field, and it was really interesting. There is an organization that has developed a tool that measures doctor empathy or empathy exhibited by medical providers. And they then use patient questionnaires to show that empathetic doctors actually result in better outcomes for patients. This is personal to me. I lost my mother a year ago to cancer. She had breast cancer that spread to her brain, and I remember when it spread to her brain, we went into the hospital, and she had a doctor that, by all accounts, was an amazing doctor. But he sort of confronted her with very kind of technically, this is what's going on. And she was terrified. And had he just said to her, ma'am, can we talk about what you want out of the next month? Right? She would have felt better. That would have been a very real outcome. And so we thought, how do we measure defender values? Because ultimately what we're teaching lawyers to do is to practice consistently with client-centered values. Far too often lawyers don't visit clients. Far too often they tell clients what they need instead of asking them what they want. Far too often they're more judge-centered because you work in the same court all the time. You don't want to get the judge mad at you, and you seem like part of the problem to the client. So we teach lawyers values, and we are developing a defender value spectrum, and we're going to use client questionnaires to try to measure the extent to which defenders practicing consistently with certain values actually result in better outcomes. So I think that's something no one's talking about. Is how important is it to have a caring lawyer, an empathetic lawyer? But I also think probably more in line with what statisticians think of. What we're not collecting now that I think we really need are how much time do lawyers spend with clients at the jail? Right? That client communication means something. Now, it doesn't get at the quality of the communication, but it tells us something. How many discovery requests are being filed? To what extent are they original and unique? Because as law firms at lawyers at Alston and Bird, you're giving your client really personalized service, right? It's not cookie cutter blueprint stuff. Can we measure that? Can we measure motions filed? And are they just boilerplate motions, or are they the kinds of motions that exhibit an understanding of the case and a creative outlook on how to litigate the case? So I think that's the kind of data that's not collected right now that could really show public defenders doing a good job.
Jason, so Jon talked about looking to other fields like medicine to sort of figure out what can be kind of taken off of that to improve the public defender system. And this is one of Southwest Airlines looked at NASCAR to make their airline deplaning and fueling better. What other, disciplines should the criminal justice system look at to improve their data collection, their understanding of the data, and kind of figuring out constantly next steps? I know John Holloway at Koch Center constantly visits this issue because he came from the pharmaceutical industry and the airline industry. But what other disciplines do you think that our CGR systems need to sort of look at?
I think one of the challenges, with lawyers specifically, and I mean this broadly in private, public, whatever, is that the adage that you went to law school because there was no math on the entrance exam, that's no longer a permissible thing for us to say, except for when I take moments like this to malign it. Because we shy away from it. I mean, data-informed litigation is now a thing that's happening in both the private and public sector to understand, like, how do you find a class? It's not about going door to door and talking to people. It's about finding the data sets that will let you know what's happening. And I think from the public law sector, they're taking a lot of lessons learned from private law in that regard, who's been doing suits like that for quite some time. I also think there's partnerships now going on between like Microsoft and Pro Bono Net. Microsoft has put up $1 million to help Pro Bono Net develop better online tools to help the self-represented litigation folks, which is maybe 80% of all civil litigants. And so it's clear that they see that particular need. I think as well, from the lawyer perspective, it's also, as a field, we're not good at acknowledging our limitations. And this is a good opportunity for us to do that in a real and concrete way, because there's all sorts of people with comp sci and data sci backgrounds that we can learn from, and they can see things that we can't. As well as those that are doing work within systems thinking. I think as we go through law school, we're trained to look at discrete legal issues and answer those particular issues without considering the ripple effect and the system of consequences that got this person there. And so there's a lot of design thinking and systems thinking that has been in the business sector for decades that is very applicable to what we're doing in the criminal justice reform space. So I think pulling a little bit from all of these particular spaces would be very advantageous.
Right. And to add on that, I mean, I'm a big fan of what Quatron is trying to do in that they have worked with the airline industry and also the medical industry, because when they have failures, when we hear about plane crashes or someone dies in surgery, they put together these councils that look at from start to finish, where did we go wrong? Where did the mechanics go wrong? Where did the flight attendants go wrong? Where did the whole thing go? Where did the failure come from? And, they started looking at, like you said, system. We have failure. The justice system isn't just the police, your lawyers, the judges, the probation and parole officers. I mean, people interact across that whole system in different ways. So when we have an individual who's reoffending or an individual who has a police encounter that results in a death, how did we get there? What was the first interaction that the individual had with the police officer? How was their interaction with the court system, their probation and parole officer? And, that was, I'm a big fan of what Quatron is trying to do in saying when we have an incident, we need to pull in the detectives and the prosecutors and the defense and the court administrators to kind of look at where did this system fail this individual, this person who is now where they're at, whether they're incarcerated or unfortunately lost their life.
Okay. So now we were going to ask each one of you. So, John, I know you're going to give us an answer on this.
If you ask a question, I'm going to give you an answer.
Yes, I just want to look back to public defense, I'm sure. Okay, so for all of us in this room, we're very committed. We want to do better. We want to see our fellow citizens, our fellow human beings do better. How can people who are interested in this issue help? What can they do?
People in the law firm, lawyers, just generally?
Lawyers generally.
Lawyers generally?
Yes.
So I think, my friend Doug Amar is here from the Georgia Justice Project. I think there are organizations in town doing really good work for folks who have gone through the system and can't figure out how to reintegrate into society. I don't think anyone's doing expungement work better than the Georgia Justice Project. I called Doug yesterday or emailed Doug about an issue in that very area. There are people who have trouble with housing, with sort of figuring out how do you get employment, how do you get a license. I think there are lots of organizations that you can work with. The AVLF, who I understand Michael Lucas was here yesterday, right? You can volunteer some time with AVLF and deal with some of those problems. Certainly, that's something lawyers can do. I think that there's systemic litigation. Places like the Southern Center for Human Rights have partnered with law firms to engage in systemic litigation because you've got litigation resources that many nonprofits and certainly public defenders don't have. That's something you can do. For us, the calls we get quite often are, we have an associate, they'd really like to get some experience in court, can they take a case? That I think is uniquely not helpful to public defenders, and let me explain to you why. Oftentimes that call, I hear that call as, what can you do for us, the law firm? We don't have the ability to get our lawyers the experience. Can you help us? And what that means is we have to figure out how to train that lawyer so that lawyer can handle one case or two cases or three cases, which is really a drop in the bucket. And my response really is, I would like to figure out how we can get law firms to see as part of their duty. Right? Law firm lawyers have been the most successful lawyers in the country. They've reaped the benefits of the profession. Can we give back by saying, look, what we will do is we will give you resources. So instead of training one of our people to take one case, train a public defender who literally otherwise would have no training to handle 300 cases a year. That's a bigger impact. And so for the broader law firms, right, when you're asking organizations what you can do, I think you have to ask the question, is this about what the organization can do for us or what we can do for the organization? But I would urge you, I teach at John Marshall, right up the street, and I do orientation, and I always share with them one of the most interesting quotes I heard from a young law student. It says, the first thing I lost in law school is the reason why I came. And I tell them, you're about to enter a 3-year experience where we are going to teach you that the law can be reduced to rules and doctrine. It can be reduced to black letters on a white page. Before you know it, you'll forget there are people behind these cases. You'll then enter a profession that will tell you the law is about mechanics and technical operations. And you'll forget that it's about people. And I try to encourage these students to understand that the most important thing you can do in 3 years is remember your purpose. Follow your purpose. And if that purpose leads you to public defense, you won't be paid well, you won't have the resources, but hopefully some of your colleagues sitting in chairs next to you will understand that they have an obligation, because they chose a path that does pay a little bit better, to give back so you can do your job more effectively.
Jason?
I think it's twofold for a predominantly legal crowd. One is that technology and data are going to, if they haven't already, fundamentally change certain rights and procedures within the criminal justice space that are just now being litigated, even though these technologies have been used for 10 or 15 years. There's algorithms that are helping decide who is released on bail and how people are sentenced. There are data merges that are going on as courts update their case management system, where information is lost within that data merge, so that warrant for your arrest you thought you'd resolved 5 years ago, you find out that resolution was lost in the data merge when you get pulled over for that out tail light. These are things that are fundamentally need to be dealt with and are affecting people in real terms. Currently, there's a case that may be taken on petition at the Supreme Court, Loomis versus Wisconsin. The Solicitor General just said, don't take this one. The issues are interesting, but this isn't the right fact pattern. But it's clear that this is going to be something that's going to get more attention on the federal court level. And that matters, because I think when people see data and math, they think it's objective. And the most important thing, if you can take away anything from this, is technology is not neutral and math is not objective. These algorithms that are putting people, keeping people in bail or helping decide sentences are opinions.
Yes.
They're opinions expressed in math. And I think as lawyers, we don't necessarily think of math that way. But that is absolutely the case. And so it's cognizant to be aware of how that is changing things. I mean, these algorithms, since you're primarily doing civil and private law, affect the way credit is done. It affects the way banking is done. And the science is drifted into the criminal justice space.
So the implicit bias is also built into our data, contrary to people's want to believe that it's impartial. Because if you think about it, humans created the data sets and the way those calculations happen. And so our mental models are really imprinted in those operations, whether we like it or not.
And those issues are only going to compound because the technology is only going to get more opaque as it becomes more complex, as we move towards neural nets and artificial intelligence, which is only a matter of time. On a personal level, if you're interested in these issues from a technology perspective, in Atlanta, there's Code for Atlanta, which is the Code for America meetup group, which is civic tech focused. They would love to have your expertise, I have no doubt, on a number of particular issues. You can provide that legal and systems knowledge to technologists that otherwise don't have that background. Or the Legal Hackers meetup group, which is more broad in scope, focuses on civil and criminal. I run the one in Baltimore, and it's an opportunity for lawyers and technologists to come together and learn from each other and begin to break down those silos. So I'd recommend, if this is an area that's interesting to you, to check out either of those groups.
And Erin, what can the non-lawyers do other than tell me, Jenny, that's too legalistic? What on earth are you talking about?
You would be surprised how many people don't actually just get involved in the policy conversation in their own community. Your representatives, your organizations working on these advocacy issues from whatever political spectrum you may align with, just need to hear from you and periodic involvement. I talk to local legislators all the time, and they say, well, that's not a problem because I don't hear from anybody about it. And it's surprising to understand that we have so many people interacting with the justice system and not calling and telling their representative, whether it's city or state, this is my experience. This is what happened to me. As much as we talk about data and other things, which is very helpful from an advocacy standpoint, because when I go in and I talk to a legislator about a policy proposal, he's like, well, prove to me why we're not doing, why what we are already doing doesn't work. So the data is really helpful. But then the personal stories also. I don't know how many times we've had legislators, policy leaders, politicians take up these issues because they meet that one person that they emotionally connected with, who's had an experience with the justice system. And then from just, for the lawyers in the room, I can only echo what Jon was talking about relative to the civil barriers a lot of people face when they are returning home. I mean, we have 48,000 collateral consequences across this country. It's housing, it's education, it's access to certain occupations, and as a legal professional, you can really help these people kind of navigate those barriers to restart their lives. I mean, we really just put this, as soon as you get out of prison, it's almost like we invest all this education and training while people are there. We talk about their opportunities when they get out after they complete treatment, and then it's just red tape after red tape, barrier after barrier for these individuals to get back to work. I mean, we're trying on the advocacy point, to refine occupational licensing practices, remove mandatory collateral consequences of conviction. But right now, these people need help navigating it. I don't know how many young entrepreneurs who, for example, we just rebuilt our website, or soon to be launched, with people who are currently incarcerated in San Quentin as part of the Last Mile Works project. They're learning to code because, surprisingly, Silicon Valley loves their entrepreneurs, whether you have a criminal record or not. So, you're talented, come on in. So you have San Quentin, who's educating people currently behind bars on how to code, how to develop websites. And when they get out, a lot of them have great ideas where they want to start their own business, be their own entrepreneur, but at the same time, they don't know how to navigate the legal restrictions that may be connected to their criminal history, or just the fact that they're newly integrated into society and want to understand, how do I start my business? So
my suggestion is to go randomly everywhere. And by that, I have had the good fortune to meet someone named Lamont Carey, who used to run the entire cocaine crack drug ring in the mid-Atlantic seaboard once upon a time. Now he's a father. He's growing kale for his woman, as he calls it, who's also his business manager. And he did not want to do work with his hands, so he didn't want to do construction. So he became a musician, a writer, a performer, entrepreneur. Erin and I,
actor,
yeah,
in
actor,
The Wire,
yeah, in The Wire. And he speaks in a different vocabulary from us. We are all in this room, some of the most educated people, but sometimes we kind of lose sight of what's really important and lose that inner child in us, hence the water pistol. That's very important, right? And
right here.
Yeah, you got one right there. Fabulous. Metaphorically, virtually, that's all great. But I think it's trying to recapture sort of the simplistic meanings, what people really care about, kind of what base back, and to listen to those conversations. Also drive across this country. I think it's really important to understand that this criminal justice problems in the system are not just urban. They are also rural. And the Vera Institute and the Safety and Justice Challenge of the Catherine T. and John D. MacArthur Foundation right now, they've posted a lot of Twitter links they tweeted a lot of stuff about how it is a rural problem, and it's increasingly becoming a rural problem. It's everyone's problem. And the beauty of America is all our imperfections, but the beauty of America is also that we've built this country, and we can solve these problems too. But it's like a diet, unfortunately, and diet and exercise. I don't think anyone can ever stop paying attention to these problems. And we got ourselves into these problems probably over the last 5 decades with policies that were meant to do good. Unfortunately, they didn't. And then now it's probably going to take at least double that time to get out of it, but we can. because we are America. Anyway, any questions for us? Come on.
Right here, Jenny.
Hi, thank you all so much. So my name is Rashida Winfrey, and I'm actually running for school board here in Atlanta. And so around criminal justice reform, or the intersection, and education, specifically as it relates to increasing graduation rates amongst youth offenders. So one of the things that I found very interesting in what you all shared is this notion of, if there's one takeaway, that technology isn't necessarily objective, and that algorithms and math is my background. I love math because it's kind of, there's no black or white, right? But the thing with that is there's no black or white, right? Not in race, but just black or white. So my question is really around this. So our new police chief in Atlanta is really big on, I think the term is like predictive policing.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I first heard this term, it was of big concern to me, because my antennas were like, well, hey, like is there bias in what we're predicting? But a good friend of mine that's very involved in criminal justice reform was like, well, no, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I still don't feel great levels of comfort around that, especially as it relates to our youth here in Atlanta. And then your statement now gives me even greater pause. So I'd love to kind of place that out there of what predictive policing really looks like, and how does that impact chances, opportunities for our youth in this city.
Do you know what platform the city wants to use?
No idea.
Punch Lab,
When she did a press conference, it was my first knowledge of this, and I was just kind of like, well, wait, what's that?
So, I mean, yes, there's the opportunity for bias, because as Jenny pointed out, the data set that they're using is the data that the police have been collecting over time, which means that all the bias that went into policing, which tends to be poor and minority communities, is going to be reflected in that tool, and it's going to spit out the same thing. So that concern is on the table. However, predictive policing writ large across platforms is snake oil. It doesn't work. No studies have shown it to be very impactful. It is a waste of money for police departments. It has the potential to do something, but all it is a nicer front end of what is hotspot mapping, which police departments have been using for decades. Cops already know where crime happens. And this tool isn't necessarily adding to that.
I mean, she spoke more of knowing who's going to commit the crimes based on if a family member has already committed a crime.
Yeah.
So it's like intervention before. So
Chicago has something like that called the heat list, and Rand put out a report a year and a half ago saying it doesn't work. It's actually, no. And that was developed by the Chicago Police Department. It wasn't a private venture that came in. They made it with a university in Cook County. So no, I mean, so far these technologies have not proven to be useful. They tend to be a waste of energy. Implementation is a big issue, which was the discussion in Chicago as well. Like this project was like one of 11 new things that they were trying to do, and so the cops said, well, I'm not going to use the thing that doesn't work, so it kind of fell to the wayside anyway on an implementation level. And it had no impact on Chicago's out-of-control murder rate anyhow. So my pushback is more from the fact that why are you wasting our time and money than worrying about it reinforcing existing bias, because that's going to happen anyway unless they go through community policing reforms and things that are actually like on the ground, hitting the street police reform.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions from other offices? We have mics in the other offices real quickly. Okay, we had a couple more here in Atlanta. No. Go ahead. Yeah, Chris.
You want to get a mic?
I do. Oh,
Yep. Yes.
Really loud. Jonathan, who's doing a good job in training public defenders? And is there a significant difference between how the federal public defenders offices are doing training versus your traditional public defenders and state systems?
Yes. So I think generally speaking, federal defenders tend to be better resourced There is mandatory training for new federal defenders. Most federal defender offices also hire people already who have some experience, so they're coming in already pretty far along the learning curve. But as far as organizations, there are states. Georgia actually, I think, does a pretty good job with limited resources training public defenders. When I came to Georgia as the training director for the state, and there's a program you're probably familiar with called TILP, Transition into Law Practice. And I think for most lawyers, it's a 2-day program. We instituted something where it's a 2-week requirement for public defenders, and that continues. Kentucky is a state that has a very good statewide public defender system. But then there are states like Alabama, for example, right, where there just isn't really any training. And so the question is, where can they get training? And there are organizations like NCDC in Macon, which is really reputable as it's basically a trial school. And it's as good as it gets when it comes to teaching trial skills. But public defenders, right, about 95% of their cases will result in pleas. I think Gideon's Promise is the only organization nationally that offers public defenders training on everything from building relationships with clients, what's the role of the public defender, investigation, discovery, all of these things, pretrial skills. No one's really focusing on that because I still think in the legal profession, we tend to identify good lawyers as having good trial skills. If I could just say one last thing about that. I was at a leadership training once, and I was facilitating a group of leaders, and they all had to bring a management challenge, a leadership challenge. And one of them said, my challenge is, I've got a lawyer in my office. He's a great lawyer, but he hates his clients. And I said, let's unpack that a little bit. Turns out what he really meant was this guy is really has a lot of trial skills, but he hates his clients. And I push back and say, can you be a great lawyer and hate your clients, or is it really just a bad lawyer who's good at trial skills, right? Good at cross-examination? But I think we've got to sort of rethink what it means to be a good lawyer before we really address the training needs.
Well, and beyond training, though, I mean, how many jurisdictions are defenders not even in the court? I mean, to expand on, training and having public defenders. I mean, National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers did a report in South Carolina, and they had court monitors going in there and seeing people going up and pleading guilty to crimes. There was except for the judge, there were no lawyers in the room.
And the police was your prosecutor.
Yeah, like there was no lawyers. People were standing up there. They were saying guilty, not understanding the judge, and they were processing people at rates unbelievable, and there was no legal counsel in the room. So beyond training, I mean, how do we even ensure that people are there?
Hey, again, it's Janine Brown with Alston Bird. So question for maybe each of you on the panel, and that is we were talking a little about community policing and would be interested to know what reforms or efforts that you think may be out there that are working. So just by way of example, the Atlanta Police Foundation working with the Atlanta Police Department over on the west side has been working with Pulte Homes to build homes, then at a reduced cost, sell them to police officers so that they're living in the community. So, I think that's new. That's something that the Atlanta Police Foundation with the Atlanta Police Department as well as members of the community is looking at. And I'm curious whether you have some perspective on what is effective or what organizations might be looking at this issue to determine what could be effective.
I think the International Association, IACP, is looking at this issue, and the Charles Koch Institute actually partnered, and I can send you the link, Janine, on a study about foot policing. That ultimately the problem, and you hear David Simon talk about this, the guy who created The Wire, that ultimately the problem is the war on drugs created this weird vacuum where the incentives became about overtime instead of about solving actual murders, rapes, robberies, and also have the police sort of figure out who their informants are and kind of learn the community quietly and kind of figure out like the big crimes as opposed to all the petty crimes. And so foot patrols is one of the kind of big things where bringing humans back in touch with other human beings. Like for all this predictive policing and everything, I think you could probably look at the mortgage subprime crisis to know that humans are not the best at predicting anything because the human heart is unpredictable. So I think the studies, most police foundations are finding that you need to bring back the police back on the ground, back talking to the neighborhoods, back talking to people, instead of just sort of looking at their computers and their phones and just typing in license plate numbers all the time and getting more tickets. Because the problem is, over the last few decades, police centers have become a revenue center, right? That's why the whole Eric Garner situation happened, because the police had to be tax collectors, and that's not really a good use of the police force, and that frankly doesn't increase public safety. It puts the police more in harm's danger, puts them as school counselors. We expect the police to do everything. And so now we're kind of back to, like, what in essence should the police do so that they keep us safe, keep themselves safe, and the community safe. So that sounds like a great idea, but I think it's back to human, like getting away from the computer and back to human touch that most of the police studies are finding right now.
And options.
Yes.
You know, you've got programs, I think, in Los Angeles and Seattle and things where the officers have more options when they're interacting with someone in crisis than just locking them up. You know, they establish centers where they can take these individuals, you know, they interact on it. They're the most direct contact in the middle of someone having a crisis. And, you know, we understand when someone is maybe on a downward spiral in a situation, whether it's mental health or drug or things. And there are jurisdictions that are seeing a lot of success where the police have other options than just literally taking them to process them in a jail or court system, where they can, take these people to treatment facilities or other intervention centers, diverting people from that interaction with the justice system.
And giving them incentives. And I think there's one county in California where they hand out the cards for public defenders.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Kudos to them.
Yeah, DOJ funded that.
But I would also say I think there are certain communities that are more likely to be impacted by our criminal justice system than others. Those communities tend to be low income, disproportionately of color, particularly in urban areas. And I think members of those communities understand that they don't commit more crimes. They're more heavily policed. And so while I absolutely agree that the way we police can be less cruel, can be more conducive to building trust in the police department, demilitarizing police departments is important in that regard. But also where we police, I think, has to be a consideration. Because I have students, I teach criminal law and criminal procedure, and every year I have students who will start talking about the criminals, and I ask them to think about the labels they use. I say, what is a criminal? Is it someone who actually violated a rule of society? Is it someone who was targeted and therefore arrested? Is it someone who was convicted? And we start debriefing this, and they start to realize, I would argue, that the highest crime area in Atlanta is probably the campus of Georgia Tech, where every 18-year-old is drank underage, right? We would never call them criminals, right? And so we don't police that kind of crime. We police marijuana possession in urban communities. And so I think some of it is understanding that certain communities understand that it's not fair from the beginning. They're being targeted while other people get away with lawbreaking.
Yeah, I've had in private, and I will not call them out, certain members of state and legislatures and members of Congress say the exact same thing. They said, I'm lucky that the police did not supervise and intervene at my college campus the way they do in these low-income communities. Otherwise, they would have been in the exact same situation as many of the people we have incarcerated.
We'd all be going to Doug for an expungement.
Or as Van Jones points out, New Haven and then Yale.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you all so much. Will you join me in thanking our panelists for this? Appreciate it. This has been incredibly informative and given us a lot to think about, and I think we can see how complex and how much there is to this issue of criminal justice reform. So thank you all so very much. We really appreciate it. And there's a handout that you have that has additional resources. Each of our panelists have provided some resources for us on this. And if you are at the firm and are interested in learning more about this or taking on opportunities in this, please contact me or Cheryl or a member of the Pro Bono Committee. And we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
And in Atlanta, there's dessert. Here. Thank you all. That was